Hello everyone and welcome. Sit back, relax, and get comfortable because this is a wonderful time for news stories from Yellowcat. Write your favorite stories in the comments below and maybe they'll be in our new video. Let's get started. Reddit lawyers, what is your greatest, most fierce, I rest my case moment? Pro se plaintiff in a federal SOX whistleblower case involving federal subsidy fraud compelled the opposing counsel to prove the judge's guilt during the initial pretrial conference call. Since neither party had expressed interest, the judge strongly recommended that we attempt to settle through their settlement judge procedure at the beginning of the call. The call goes through, and I tell the judge that the hearing should take place in a federal court in Washington, D.C., when she asks where. "Wait a minute, this isn't going to be in a public courtroom, is it?" the opposing counsel exclaimed. "We assumed that a conference room would host the hearing." The judge replies, "No, this hearing will be bench trial in a public courtroom. The jury box will be empty," and I included with big poster board showing how the fraud works. At this point, the opposing counsel lost all composure and declared, "We object." "You can't object. This is a pre-hearing conference call," the judge declared. "Well, we're going to object," was the reply from the opposing counsel. Right away, she stated, "We'd like to go to the settlement judge. The cost of litigation will be high, and we would like to avoid it." However, the settlement failed. After they caught their breath during the settlement process, they made no further offers, so I withdrew, and the case is now headed to motions. I was a second-year associate in handling my first trial. I represented the plaintiff. The defendant had an expert witness who had testified previously in about 40 similar cases. This expert came out to my client's property and did a completely BS examination of the issue, and his expert report was equally as BS. For those of you that don't know, expert testimony needs to meet a certain standard, the Daubert standard, at least in my state, in order to be admissible. This guy basically took some photos and put a ruler on the ground a few times to make his report seem legit. The partners at my firm told me it wasn't worth trying to file a Daubert motion to strike his report/testimony because the case was low value, under $100K, and those types of motions can be very complex and didn't want to bill the client for it. I was so angry about this guy being deemed an expert that I came in on a weekend on my own time and drafted a 20-page motion to strike his testimony. I didn't bill the client a dime. The defendant didn't file a response to my Daubert motion to strike. Instead, they waited until right before the expert was set to testify. He had been sitting in court racking up fees for 2 full days beforehand. The judge had the jury leave the room, put the expert on the stand, and allowed the defendant to do a direct examination of their report. The defendant's attorney, not taking my motion seriously, had their inexperienced associate, just like me, do the examination. It was incredibly basic and didn't respond to any of the points in my motion. I was in charge of doing his cross-exam. It was my first cross-exam of a witness ever. I tore the guy, a seasoned expert witness, apart on the stand. I got his entire testimony and report struck. They also had a second expert witness who was pretty terrible, but not quite as terrible. I also did his cross-exam. Realizing that they were in serious trouble with their primary expert and their second expert at risk of being struck, the lead counsel for the defendant, a named partner at a well-known firm, did the direct exam for the second expert. I again did the cross. I got the second expert's testimony struck except for one very, very tiny area. So essentially, he was forced to testify with both hands tied behind his back. It was the most gratifying moment of my legal career so far. Obligatory not a lawyer, but I was defending myself against a debt collector for a debt so old I could not even remember for sure that it was mine. The debt collector asked me, "Can you show me the signed contract and a proof of ownership for the debt?" Lawyer for debt collectors. No sounds. I see the judge. Judge's lawyer. "Can you do that?" Well, going through papers, the debt collector's lawyer. "Oh, well, no, not right now, Your Honor. You be the judge. Case thrown out." Note, a debt collector has to show how it got the right to collect your debt in order to prove that they own it. Over and over again, old debts are often sold to different people who want to buy them. Since the original creditor is still owed money, the debt collector has to show a chain of title that goes back to them to prove each assignment. For old debts, it's usually not possible for the collector to show this. I represented a man in a slip-and-fall case in a national chain that grills chicken. Because cleaning the grills involves using a garden hose after using chemicals to remove all of the grease, the restaurant is not supposed to do it until after they close. Up to 2 or 3 hours may be spent packing up food for the following day, cleaning the grills, mopping, and other tasks during the close-down procedure. The company refused to pay more than an hour's wages after closing, even though they were aware of this. Because of this, the cooks and shift managers agreed to begin the closing procedure 2 hours prior to closing while patrons were still in the restaurant. This is extremely risky since food delivery workers can follow the greasy water into the lobby where patrons were gathered. 2 hours before the restaurant closed on a fateful day, one of the cooks was washing down the grills with a hose and cleaning them. The cook must work with this slurry so slippery that they need to wear slip-resistant shoes and a plastic smock. The cook enters the lobby and follows the chemicals into a hallway to clean some tables while he waits for them to remove the grease, which takes about 15 minutes. After using the restroom, my client stumbles in the oily water. He strikes his head so forcefully that surgery is necessary to repair a subdural hematoma. Of course, that day the video system wasn't functioning. Anyway, the cook was fired shortly after, and during the legal dispute, the company said that they were unable to find him. After doing some research, I discovered the cook's relative, which helped me locate the cook. While he acknowledged that he was cleaning the grill, he refuted claims that he or any other employee had brought the greasy water into the lobby. Throughout the 3-week trial, the company testified that cleaning before closing was against their policy and that it never occurs. Therefore, there had to be another reason why my client fell. We were going to call the cook as a witness, so I was speaking with him prior to the trial. He was furious that he was let go. I responded, "Do you think they're still cleaning before closing? Because they're denying that they do." I heard him say, "Absolutely." I sent my investigator to the restaurant on the first day of the trial 2 hours before it closed at the moment my client was hurt in order to record video on his cell phone, regardless of whether the establishment was being cleaned. They had the hose out and everything. Guess what? That they would carry on doing this at the restaurant in question in the case was beyond shocking to me. I instructed my investigator to return up there to check if the cook and shift manager were acting in the same way when they took over. Indeed, they were. The defense introduced their general manager for the area at the conclusion of the trial. He vowed unequivocally that this would never occur. Their final witness was him. We say, "Judge, we need a sidebar," as we stand up. We showed the other side the video in the judge's chambers. The corporation's lawyer was going crazy. It was allowed for rebuttal by the judge. 2 hours before the jury's deliberations began, they played a 5-minute video clip featuring the sound of the hose while they cleaned the grills. With that video, we utterly destroyed their entire defense in a 3-week trial. Goes without saying that we won. It is extremely uncommon to use sub-rosa video against a defendant in this manner, I should add. Typically, during the trial, they cease engaging in prohibited activities. I guess the restaurant didn't get the memo. What's your best story about quitting a job? I was hired as a field service mechanic by a construction equipment maintenance company, but it didn't take long for me to decide this wasn't the company I wanted to work for. The facilities were appalling. No running water in the shop, no compressed air, the back lot looking like the moon surface, etc. The management and dispatching were shady, and the lighting was appalling. It was tedious, and there wasn't enough work, so a lot of look-busy assignments were given. A guy who was supposed to be a designated equipment cleaner/gopher was hired, but he wasn't happy about being the only one without a company car, in addition to being resentful of his physical short stature. He began physically challenging me. I'm 6'3", 320 pounds and a U.S. Marine, but he was always out of sight and earshot of other people, which is when the Napoleonic complex became an issue. Naturally, I won't comply with him because Come on. But things continued to get worse, so I eventually brought it up with my manager, the service manager. "Can you work together?" he asked. I said, of course, since I was usually away from him while traveling. However, I also pointed out that the environment he was creating on the shop floor was extremely toxic. The short guy enjoyed berating me about things like my parking spot, I was in his way, and where I kept my toolbox, it's in the way too, and a bunch of other manufactured small talk. After being assured that everything would be handled, there was silence for a week. I inquired around when it started up again and discovered that he behaved this way around everyone else with the exception of the service manager. Others informed me that he had also made threats against a few other service employees, created a commotion, gotten into fights, and constantly complained. I almost got into a physical altercation with the service manager, but I managed to get past him and inform the branch manager, who was also a Marine, of the situation. He instructed me to inform HR of the situation. That infuriated my service manager greatly, but he didn't say anything. After HR interviewed and did its job, things subsided for a few weeks before picking back up with Shorty. To cut a long story short, the branch manager instructed me to get in touch with HR once more after I brought up the issue. I didn't follow up on HR's new process because I had already received a quick reprimand from the service manager for a small safety infraction. After a few weeks, the regional service manager stopped by the shop and inquired about my impression of it. I was honest with him, telling him that it's unsafe, ill-equipped, and that the larger drainage pit that was made in the concrete for pressure washing equipment had been left open for more than a month. It was a large hole that measured about 4 by 10 by 18 and had been a danger for some time. I told him I didn't know, I just work here, and it's way above my effing pay grade when he asked who was in charge of that. That upset him, but at that point, I didn't give a D. When I arrived the next morning, the first service manager noticed me and invited me to join him in an empty office. I was asked to take a seat by the regional service manager, who was already inside at a desk. Thank you, I thought, assuming this was about Shorty. I sat down and made a note. After shutting the door, service manager number 1 sat down again against a distant wall. I went to a meeting where I thought we would solve problems, but because of my negative attitude, I ended up getting counseling instead. Regional was initially slow and courteous, but he soon raised his voice and began berating me for completely false accusations that I'm sure came from service manager number 1. This continued for about 10 minutes before I asked, "Why am I sitting here? I'm listening to this, but why? Why must I put up with this?" was a question I was unable to adequately respond to. Just as Regional is building up to a crescendo, I stood up silently. Speaking no more, Regional leaned back in a distinctly defensive position, as if scared. Suddenly, service manager number 1 had a worried expression. I silently said, "Send someone for the truck, I'll be back for my tools," and grabbed my wallet to take out the company credit and gas cards. I then placed them on the desk in front of me and walked out. There was a noticeable silence. That afternoon, someone quietly and quickly made their way to my house, took the truck, and left without a word. A week later, I returned for my tools, and service manager number 1 was very kind and open, inquired about me and my prospects, and was very amiable. I winched my toolbox onto my trailer, ignoring him in the process. The branch closed just 6 months later. I was recruited by a firm out of Connecticut before that happened after I updated my resume on LinkedIn, and used to take great delight in seeing the old shop from the air as I flew in from one job to the other, making substantially more money and enjoying far greater benefits. Service manager was sent to a lone, isolated branch in the southern part of the state where he was a mechanic, and the company has since folded. I never heard of what happened to Shorty. Don't much care either. Worked for an IT place as a basic tech. They had a single guy who managed an internal data center where rack space and virtual machine instances were rented, in addition to handling all of the on-call and on-site server work for numerous companies. After an emergency cardiac surgery, they just dumped all of his belongings on me. I'd never touched a business network, I'd never seen a server, and all they offered me was do your best support. I had no effing idea what any of this was. For 2 months, I endured this H, working more than 60 hours a week, taking calls, driving, and earning minimum wage. Not a single time did I mess something up or fail to resolve a problem. They also refused to pay me for more than 37.5 hours worked per week at the same time, citing the reason that the owner is in China right now and we can't release the extra funds without him. And they were blustering, saying things like, "Oh, you didn't submit all the information we need, so we can't reimburse you for gas and mileage." Information that was never mentioned, never asked for on the forms they provided, and was not included in any documentation. They owed me more than $2,500 in unpaid wages after just 2 months, and that doesn't even account for overtime. I drove home on Friday and never returned. A few days later, they sent me an email with my name in the subject line, no text, and termination documents along with the information about when to pick up my last paycheck. The vice president had the audacity to say, "You don't just stop showing up to work. You don't do that to someone." To which I replied, "Yeah," and went in to get it. They docked me half of what they owed me for the last 2 weeks I worked, and everything else they owed me wasn't there. You do not simply stop paying those who labor for you. Spent the rest of the day calling every client I had done work for and told them the truth, that I had no idea what I was doing and should not have been working on their stuff without support. Company closed down a few months later. Thank you for listening to these stories. If you want to see new videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the like button.